Thank you for joining us again at the Financial Philosophers podcast. So, as you may have saw from the title of this podcast episode, we're going to be talking about practicing financial minimalism. The inspiration for this is multifaceted. Danny, you recently, I actually think it was in the last episode, or it was one of our previous episodes. It might have been when we were talking about net worth. You had mentioned something about financial minimalism and wanting to explore that. Danny, you gave a really awesome pitch at the end about after you shared details about your net worth, but then you also pivoted and explained, that's not the driving purpose of this, though. Like, the point behind a lot of this is to achieve financial freedom, to be intentional with my life. And it was a really cool personal side to the finance question.
Definitely. I think that we can get too caught up in the numbers, right? Sure. There is certainly something to be said for kind of delayed gratification and putting off some of those maybe more fun purchases or activities to a certain degree until later when you're more financially stable. But
yeah,
none of us are guaranteed another day. So striking a balance of living in the moment and planning for the future is what I think both of us are truly striving for.
Yeah, agreed. And there are a lot of different ways you can try to approach that, right, to achieve that. Today we're going to focus on this topic of minimalism, at least to try and see if we can explore this in the realm of personal finance. So, to our listeners, you may have heard the term minimalism or minimalist before. The term financial minimalism is often used to mean more or less the same thing as minimalism, but more in the context of personal finance.
I'm really interested in diving into this because I think most people know what minimalism is and kind of paring down, cleaning out your house, decluttering your life. But I think even I myself am a little murky on what we're going to dive into in terms of the financial side of minimalism.
Right. Well, I think it's always going to be murky to some extent, right? Because it is subjective in many ways, right? Like, what minimalism means to somebody may be different from what it means to the next person.
Okay,
right?
That's fair.
And a lot of people have encountered this topic either online or maybe they've seen. I remember watching a documentary on Netflix. I think it was literally called Minimalism or something along those lines.
That checks out.
Yeah, and then I think you and I were talking off mic. I think there was a show with Marie Kondo, Tidying Up, if I'm remembering correctly.
Yeah, I never watched it, but I remember seeing it. Yeah, seeing that title.
Yeah, so there are all different flavors of what minimalism is, but I did a quick Google search before we started recording today. I just wrote down a few things that I thought were intriguing. These are just quotes I pulled from online from Googling, like, what is minimalism, to see if somebody could more succinctly define what it is than you and I could. So here are a couple things from Google searches. I'm not going to quote anybody or websites. This is just what I found. So one website said, minimalism is a tool to rid yourself of life's excess in favor of focusing on what's important, so you can find happiness, fulfillment, and freedom. Another one said, being a minimalist means intentionally promoting the things we most value and removing everything that distracts us from it.
Okay, I like that.
Those are, pretty cool definitions, pretty profound. And so, we're going to talk about how does this relate to us, in the realm of personal finance. How do we draw that connection there? So where might financial minimalism exist in our daily lives? How can it be practiced, for lack of a better term? Danny, you and I have talked about a couple things in previous episodes where I think we've more or less been hinting at it. We just haven't been calling it financial minimalism, right? We talk a lot about
definitely
being very intentional with our spending, right?
Frugal in some places, but being willing to spend additional when it matters, when the quality of an item or a purchase will affect its usability and function throughout the rest of your life, things of that nature.
Yeah. I think I gave some examples on that in one episode about the sleeping bags,
yes,
or the coffee,
yes,
the coffee gear and whatnot. So, you just reminded me of a quote I heard someone say, and I'm probably butchering this, but it was something along the lines of spend luxuriously on the things that matter to you and frugally on the things that don't.
Yep.
I think it was something along those lines. But yeah, it's being intentional with that spending. We've covered that a lot. We talked a lot about that in the in several episodes, but in particular, we also covered it in the budgeting episode. So I would argue going through the practice of developing a budget and building your net worth is a way of organizing and simplifying your finances, right? Like, imagine your life, well, for any of our listeners who have not actually gone through the practice of budgeting and building out their net worth, there may be things that are stressing you out without you even realizing it, right? You may have these expenses floating in the background that you keep seeing charged to your credit card, yet you may not be aware of when they're hitting your credit card and what expenses are still being charged online, whatever it might be. Not having those things organized or simplified in some way causes additional stress, right? And it's easy to punt those things off.
That's a great call out. So I think that in order to begin the process of incorporating minimalism into your life, you first need to get a handle on what your financial life looks like, with that budgeting and kind of like quick and dirty net worth calculation that we already talked about.
Yeah, I mean, think about how that tracks even to regular life, right? Like, I think some of in traditional minimalism, one of the exercises you can do is to go through all of your belongings, like open up boxes that you have in storage, look in drawers, look in the back of your closet, and you're going to find things that you probably forgot you even had. You may not even remember that you owned it, right?
I think the official kind of hardline rule in doing that is if you haven't touched it in 6 months, then you probably don't need it. There are some exceptions to that depending on what it is, but if you just have a lot of stuff hanging around and you haven't even thought about it in more than 6 months, there's a pretty good chance it is not going to have an effect on your life if you get rid of it.
Right. And going through that process, right? You're starting to realize, wow, this thing that I bought that I've maybe used once or maybe not at all, wasn't really an intentional purchase. It didn't really, bring any type of deep meaning or intention to my life.
Definitely.
It's
we're all guilty of those impulse purchases.
Totally.
I've been, I think, getting better about it recently. Not that I was necessarily terrible about it in the past, but I am in the process of trying to clear out my entire house. I have a family, little kids. Everything kind of accrues if you don't keep an eye on it and just builds up in your house. And I am actively trying to pare down everything that we own for every person. And so anytime I might consider purchasing something, I'm thinking, do I really want another physical object in my home while I'm trying to get rid of, just truckloads of stuff every week? Not that I have that much stuff, but you know what I'm saying.
I'm with you on that. I'm also going through something similar, where I'm trying to pare down all of our belongings and look through bins and a couple boxes we have that are in storage, and just really asking myself, do I need this still? Can I donate this thing, or could I sell it online and recoup some of my costs? Things of that nature.
That's another point to touch on is so many Americans. And I'm not sure about how it is in the rest of the world, but so many Americans have storage units. And sometimes it makes sense. And I think in your case, it makes sense given maybe some of the future plans you have. But for many people, they just become a repository for all this stuff you aren't willing to get rid of, but you never use anymore. And it is such a drain on your finances that it would really make sense for most people to go through them and see, can we just get rid of this unit and become more minimalist?
That's an interesting example you bring up there. Yeah, I do have a storage unit. Most of my life I'd never have So my wife and I have moved, oh my gosh, in the past 10 years of our relationship, I want to say we've moved 12 times, I think.
That is so much. That is
Yeah,
definitely not the norm.
No. It's definitely not. I mean, we were moving around a lot for career purposes and education purposes. You know, her going back to school twice for 2 additional degrees. So we had to, in many ways, we had no choice but to be minimalist in some ways,
absolutely.
right? Like, it's really hard to uproot and move when you have a lot of belongings. But we actually got to a point where, for the first time in our life, we were renting a small house because we are only here temporarily for 3 years. She has a 3-year contract with the hospital here. And this was the best option available to us, which worked because we are pretty good at keeping our material possessions down. But it did get to a point where we were like, you know, we have a lot of outdoors gear. We have bikes and skis and, you know, tents and those lovely sleeping bags that we spent a lot of money on. Those are all material possessions. Now, I would argue they are material possessions that we were very intentional about buying because they support a very meaningful lifestyle that we wish to have, which is one of adventure, right? Outdoors activities. But, you know, even if you are trying to practice minimalism, you may still find these weird conundrums where your lifestyle choices or your belongings, which may have meaning, are still taking up space. So I think it's just, you have to be mindful of that too, right? It's I think that for me, and again, this is where the subjective element comes in, minimalism or financial minimalism, as we put it, to me, it means I want to be able to be more intentional and cognizant of my belongings and my spending. But I don't want it to be such a driving force that I'm foregoing the things that matter to me. Like,
absolutely,
you know, yeah.
And I mean, that's adventures. As with basically everything we've talked about up to this point through all of our episodes, it all comes down to balance, finding a balance in life, finding a balance in minimalism, you know, what makes sense for you and your goals and your lifestyle and just the way that you live, right? Right. You can certainly go too far in either direction, regardless of the topic we're talking about.
Totally. Yeah. I think there is such a thing as being too extreme with any type of philosophy in life. Going back to some of the things we've talked about before, another thing that came to mind was when we talked about the credit card episode we did. You had mentioned, Danny, that you only have 1 or 2 credit cards?
We have 2.
2? Yeah.
Specifically to keep the utilization down between the 2 of them.
Yeah, and so I think that's an amazing example of financial minimalism, right? I know a lot of people, myself included, I have more than 2 credit cards. I've met people with 10 to 15 credit cards, even more sometimes. And
that is a lot of accounts to juggle. That is far too many.
Exactly. And even if you are perfect with maximizing all of your points, assuming that you're not allowing the points to dictate and cause bad spending habits, as we discussed in that episode, assuming all those things are true, that is still a lot to manage, right? You have to ask yourself, is this really worth the headache of having to juggle all of these things? Do the benefits outweigh the detriment to your time management or your personal stress? It's a good question. I think it's going to differ for everybody, but it's one worth asking on these types of things. Some other areas that came to mind when I was thinking about this was literally the number of investment accounts or bank accounts you have. Right?
Okay.
I used to have several different bank accounts because when rates were low, I was trying to maximize certain things, and I'd see a new attractive rate come up on an online high yield savings account that was, I don't know, at the time 1% or something, right?
You were one of the few bank customers whose money had very little stickiness. You moved it all the time.
Yeah. And um, yeah, it was stressful. I am still dealing with the ramifications of that because I got an email from a bank that I wasn't even aware we still had an account open. There's
Oh
no money
wow.
in it.
Okay.
It's literally zero. There are no fees. There's no minimum account balance or anything like that. But I just realized it's like, wow, been a minute since I've looked at that. I had forgotten we even had that open. It's zeroed out, but it just had never formally been closed. And so, you know, when I when I finally consolidated everything to one account online and operated under just that one umbrella, I'll admit, um, quality of life improved dramatically in
That's
my
great.
personal finances.
We
Yeah.
have two bank accounts. We have one brick and mortar account, and then one solely online account for high
Mm.
yield savings.
Yeah.
And I get why some people would have only the online, but it's just helpful to have that brick and mortar that we can transfer funds to if we need.
Yeah. Yeah. It was for the longest time for me, it was the ability to write a check, but then I realized these online banks also have check writing abilities. So the need to have a traditional brick and mortar bank was becoming less and less so. And so I finally made that move.
In regards to investment accounts, um, my wife and I, each have a 401k through work, and
mhm.
then all of the other investment accounts, Roth, taxable brokerage, kids custodial accounts are all through the same company. Do you have something different? Have you really spread out in terms of your accounts? Are you trying to consolidate?
This is that's a really good question. When I was working with clients in the past, there was always the question of, do you roll over your old 401k to an IRA or under the advisor's management, for example? Um, there are a lot of questions you can ask, like, what are the fees being charged in the 401k versus what the fees in the IRA are? Um, what about your financial advisor's fees too, right? Like, if they stay at the 401k, maybe they're not being charged your advisor's fee, whereas if you bring it over to your advisor, it would be charged. Those are all separate questions in terms that have more to do with like the value of financial planning you're getting perhaps from
Sure.
a financial planner or whatever it might be. But if we're talking purely on the topic of financial minimalism, I have spoken with a lot of people. I'm continuously shocked to hear how often people will leave their money in a 401k and just keep change. They'll get a new job or they'll move to another job, and next thing you know, they have multiple 401ks. I've even met people who weren't aware that you could even transfer them. Right? It was like, yeah,
Absolutely.
it's just with the 401k. It's in its thing. I don't do anything with it. And it's like, no, that's an account that you have control over. And where is that money? What's the name of who has that account? Is it Fidelity? Is it Vanguard? Who is it? I've met folks who couldn't even answer those questions, and so
Yep.
I'm glad you brought this up because to any of our listeners, if you have investment retirement accounts from employers or previous employers, keep track of that. Make sure that you know where those dollars are, and you might consider consolidating those if it makes sense for your situation. That could be a lot to juggle as well, right? Imagine trying to keep up with making sure that every single dollar in all of those accounts spread out all over the place are all invested and appropriately invested, and your overall allocation amongst all accounts are actually in line with your risk tolerance. And that becomes very, very difficult very quickly to be able to juggle and prudently manage.
Absolutely. And that kind of
Yeah.
leads us into the next point. And I myself was certainly guilty of this when I started investing. I invested in way too many individual companies for my comfort. And this is in terms of the actual investments you are choosing within your accounts, right?
Yeah.
And if you are investing in just dozens or hundreds of individual companies, not only is that going to be incredibly time consuming to truly and accurately track the performance of those companies, but your account is going to look disgusting. I mean, you're going to open it and it's just going to be walls of text and numbers that, might make some people's eyes glaze over. And I am in the process of consolidating and paring down some of those and moving. I do like index funds, but moving more so into them and kind of cleaning up, at least my taxable brokerage, which is where that mess kind of happened. How do you feel about that?
We are talking about two separate questions here, right? So one is optimal investment portfolio allocation on whatever you, the investor, believes that to be, and the other is simplifying your finances and your investments to the point where you're
Definitely
not spending so much time on them. And this is yet again another conundrum, right? It's like investing in individual companies. First and foremost, that could be a future episode on its own.
We'll need to dive into it.
The challenges of doing that, right? It's a completely different thing than just buying a broadly diversified basket of companies in a mutual fund or an ETF. But, in your situation, right? Like, you have to ask yourself this question: will my investment performance and quality of life be better anyway if I'm not stressing and worrying about the management of all these different moving parts, having dozens of individual investments as opposed to having, just a few? That's an important question you have to explore. I can't give an answer to it.
I think I'm basically opening a rare, very, very complicated can of worms. So let's hold that until a future episode. Sure. And dive into your idea you had brought up of the difference between mild adoption and extreme adoption.
Yeah, so I think the biggest thing is, like anything we talk about on this podcast, we explore a lot of thought experiments, a lot of different concepts. This idea of financial minimalism is just one, right? And what it means to you and to what extent you adopt certain things from it in your life is going to come down to who you are and some of your personal preferences. The point is whether you just take little bits and pieces in a more mild approach, or you take very extreme changes to your life and adopt it in an extreme approach. Both can have their benefits, right? So some mild ways to adopt financial minimalism is just building better habits, right? Improving your self-awareness, going through a budget in your net worth, and just making some quick key observations that you weren't even aware of, right? And it doesn't take much time. And even these simple observations can have profound effects on how they change your financial habits for the better.
Definitely. Taking the time to catalog your accounts, investments, bank accounts, etc., will allow you to start taking control and deciding where to implement minimalism in your life. Right.
And I use this phrase a lot when I'm talking with my wife in general terms of like productivity, or when you hit something that really interests you. I call it riding the wave. And so if you are exploring this concept of financial minimalism and you start to pick up some things that are working for you and really helping, and it creates this wave, and you want to surf that wave for as far as it takes you, and it ends up leading to some really exciting, dramatic life changes in a more extreme way, then by all means, do it. Who's to say that you shouldn't do it, right? I'm not going to stop you.
And I resonate with that concept and what you just explained so much. Like this new concept is so fun and shiny. Let's chase it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I mean, I've already shared some examples of my wife and I sleeping out in sub-zero weather with awesome sleeping bags and saving money on Airbnbs and hotels, right? That's pretty extreme, but for us, we leaned into it. We rode that wave. It complemented our lifestyle and things we enjoy. I've met people who have trucks or school buses that they repurpose for living out of, or living out of a Sprinter van, where they like turn it into like a house, and they're like super minimalist, and they're living
hashtag van life.
Yeah, 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 and like they're traveling all over the place and having an amazing life, and their expenses are extremely low because they've just really pared down. You know, you could fall on the mild side of this or the extreme side of this. Just look for things that work for you. Be open to this concept and see if there's anything that resonates with you. And I think that kind of leads into, some of the key takeaways here, Danny, is like, think about the ways that minimalism or financial minimalism might benefit your life, right? Entertain the ways that minimalism and financial minimalism intersect, right? You could argue that everything we do in life in some way ties back to personal finance in some way, right? You can stretch it there. And ultimately,
unless you're living in the forest, just growing your own food. But that's a whole different story.
Hey, but that is a version of extreme minimalism, right?
Sure.
I mean, why not? Like learning how to plant your own food, that's huge. That's pretty cool. Ultimately just be intentional with the dollars you spend. When you're exploring this concept, ask yourself, are there any financial habits that you have? Spending, saving, investing, paying bills, managing your finances. Are any of these habits causing you unnecessary stress? Are there any inefficiencies in your processes that you have, how you go about your daily life, that are actually distracting you from the things that matter? This is just another tool to put in your tool belt for living a more examined life. Putting more emphasis on the things that matter to you and cutting out the things that don't.
Absolutely. I certainly know that on the personal side, if I pare down and consolidate investment accounts and financial tasks and everything so it's streamlined and more automated, then I have a lot less stress and I can focus on my day-to-day life.
Yeah, absolutely. So to our listeners, ask yourself, does the idea of financial minimalism help you better achieve your goals and help you achieve financial freedom? I'd say let's find out together. I think that's all I have for today, Danny.
Awesome. Thanks so much for talking through this with me, Chris.
Yeah, thank you, Danny. I appreciate it.
It's always fun, very insightful. To everyone listening, hope that you took a lot out of this. And as always, have a great week.
See you next time. Thanks.